So welcome to the webinar, and today's topic is on transactional coaching, so TA coaching. I'm Damion Wonfor, I'm the founder of Catalyst, and I'm really pleased to be joined by a colleague, a friend, and also a faculty member, Sandra Goddard. So Sandra is a business psychologist, she's a coach supervisor, a team coach, and as people who train with us know, she also is one of the faculty members of our courses. So thanks for joining us today, Sandra.
Absolute pleasure.
So the session is going to be around about 30 minutes, and Sandra and I are going to be in conversation about TA and coaching. So I would encourage you to close down other applications that you may have open, and just think about what you need to do so you can be fully present today. We're going to talk a lot about being an adult during this conversation, I'm sure. So the idea of being in mindful adult, what do you need to do to get present for this conversation? So Sandra, I thought it'd be helpful to start with a question, just to take us into this topic. But, you know, I'm sure people listening will have heard of transactional analysis. So what would you say TA offers to coaches?
Oh, thank you, Damion. I'm already aware that we've got 30 minutes and possibly covering quite a lot. So people listening in are going to vary in terms of, if you like, their exposure, their experience of TA. So this is really a snapshot. But in terms of what I feel it offers coaches, I think it's multi-pronged, and I doubt that's a surprise to you that kind of I'm off on my storytelling now. So firstly, I think it's three-pronged, if I can distill it down to three prongs. Firstly, it offers a psychological framework, which from my perspective really has an aligned ethos or underpinning philosophy that akin to coaching. So the principles of that, firstly, everyone is okay, that people are capable of making decisions, of being able to create change for themselves, and in so doing, everyone can think. So I'm immediately linking that to, if you like, potentiality. Yeah. So as coaches, we come with a belief that our clients have the potential to resource themselves. I think it's also a reminder that coaching is about working with people who come with, if I may call it, psychological well-being. All right. Although other things may emerge, and then that it serves us to then question, well, to what extent is coaching the appropriate thing for them at that point in time? But it's also about, I think, a good reminder that as coaches, we are there to help facilitate our clients raising their awareness, their responsibility, and their choice. And that comes back then to those principles. So that's the first prong. The second prong is in the title, although we shorten it now to TA, is that it stands for transactional analysis, as you've said. And what is transaction other than a dynamic? A dynamic within ourselves, be it myself as the coach, within the client, so intrapsychic dynamics, as well as the dynamic between us, yeah, the coach and the coachee. So that's the second. And thirdly, that there are a number of tools and techniques, frameworks within the transactional analysis model that we currently draw upon. So it might be drama triangle, winner's triangle, ego states. We may talk about that a little bit further in a moment. You know, strokes, you know, what are the reinforcers for us? Drivers, or as Julie Hay talks about, working styles, permissions versus injunctions. So those are the messages that we receive and the impact they have on us. So there's a lot that we can actually use. So if I was to put a wrapper around all of that, I would say that I view TA as a relational framework. The relationship we have with ourselves, so internalized, and the relationship, the dynamic that we have with other people.
Thank you, Sandra. And that sort of sense, I suppose, the just picking up on a couple of pieces, that sort of mindset that we're holding, especially where the coachee may not be, viewing themselves in that way, in terms of the potentiality, that sort of the I suppose psychological awareness that this approach can enable us to have about that intrapsychic process, as you're saying. Also, what may be happening for the coachee and what's happening between us, and then the toolkit in terms of some of the models that you've been naming. And actually, in my experience, coachees generally get them and respond well to them in terms of the language and I suppose the frameworks and approaches that you're describing. And just before I sort of build on this, I just want to point out to the people that are listening, we have other webinars that, for instance, Sandra and I recorded about TA drivers, working styles, as you just mentioned. There's another webinar on our YouTube channel around the drama triangle as well. So some additional resources that you can access as well as this session. So I suppose just let's just move into perhaps you've mentioned some of the models there, but if we take something like ego states, because again, these dynamics that you're talking about and how helpful this lens can be for coaches, do you want to say a bit around what we mean by ego states and just perhaps describe them a bit more?
Yes, very happy to. So Byrne in the 1940s, 1950s, very clever man, decided to develop and very innovative in those days, actually, a model, a psychological model that clients could relate to. You've already touched on, Damion, the accessibility of the language. So that was a key thing for him, a key value that underpins this framework. And so very different to the then psychoanalytic interventions as a therapeutic intervention. He really wanted his clients to be in the driving seat and to be able to understand themselves as opposed to being told how they were, who they are. So his model is in one way quite simple, not simplistic, simple, because he talks about 3 key states that everybody, that's as human beings, we flip in and out of all of the time. And they are the parent ego state, adult ego state, and child ego state. And we flip in and out of those all of the time intrapsychically. The parent ego state is really around or typifies our past experiences, our lived experiences from when we're born, possibly even earlier, in utero. And they're around, if you like, therefore, what should be, because they're based on the past of what should be. And they split out into 2 further ego states: controlling parent, or critical parent, sometimes known as, and nurturing parent. Adult is very much about being in the here and now, and in that sense, about objectivity, about dealing with the circumstances as they are now, really dealing with having thoughts and feelings about the situation as it is now, as opposed to the past. And the last is child ego state, which is really about encapsulating, again, formed very much from our past, our lived experience from childhood onwards, our emotions and our feelings. Differently to parent, it's also about spontaneity. All right. Before I leave the ego states, I'd just like to say that we're going to be focusing on what is known as the functional model. So it's far more behavioral, and it's the one that people working within organizations as consultants or coaches, that's the model that we typically be focusing on. There is another framework, just to make matters a little bit more interesting, that is used within the psychotherapeutic world, which is known as the structural model, all right, which is far more intricate, for want of a better word, in terms of how those ego states and what comprises those ego states. But we're sticking with the functional model for now.
Thanks, Sandra. And again, that sort of behavioral lens, I think, is really helpful when we're thinking about our experiences of these ego states in self, and what we may meet in terms of the coaching client as well.
It's what do you see?
Mm-hmm.
What do you hear?
Yeah, like the language of the shoulds, the parent, etc. So just say, I think where I want to go now is just this idea of being in the adult ego state as the coach, so just say a bit more, if I'm a coach and I'm, in terms of the way I'm being is that sort of mindful adult. So what would that actually mean?
Well, in coaching, we so often talk, don't we, about being in adult to adult relationships. And, my interpretation on that is, one, that's about being in the here and now. And with our training as coaches, we've learned to be in the here and now, to be present, to be mindful, to perhaps practice mindfulness. Yeah. And our intent as coaches is, I believe, to support our clients with whatever they're bringing to session, to be in the here and now. Okay, so that's what I mean by being in adult, that we're supporting our clients, we're facilitating our clients to appraise the situation as it stands, as opposed to being the phrase that comes to mind at the moment is sucked back into what is right or not right from a parent ego state, because you're coming with already pre-framed judgments. Yes. Another aspect of being in adult to adult for me, and as coaches I would like to think that we model, is this quality of being non-judgmental. So I'm okay, you're okay. So I coach, I'm okay, and we haven't even started work yet, but you client, you're okay. And in so doing, modeling that perspective, that mindset to develop within your client, that they are okay, and that whatever they're bringing is also, because a lot of it is relational, is okay as well. Might be difficult, might be challenging, but coming from that I'm okay, you're okay standpoint.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, that sort of place of okayness I often talk about when I'm working with people or groups. This may be a learning edge, this may be difficult, but actually I'm coming from a place of okayness because you feel resourced to be there. Like you said earlier, there's psychological well-being here, which means that you can be okay with this learning edge.
Yeah, and I think, just taking that a little bit further then, that as coaches in that okay adult to adult space, not only are we, I believe, more equipped with inquiry and to nurture our clients to be inquiring and curious about their situation. I think as coaches, when we're in that space, thinking from an emotional intelligence perspective, we're even more attuned through our listening to be able to tune in to what is spoken, what is not spoken, and however, whatever is shared is expressed.
Yeah, and felt.
Exactly. Yes.
So I suppose thinking about sort of the parent and the child ego stage, which are resources in it as well. This idea we're holistic. So just say a bit about accessing. I want you to say a bit about accessing parent and child, because I think otherwise it can become quite sort of black and white, that parents bad, adults good, child's bad. So just say a bit about me accessing my child or parent ego states.
Well, I think you touch on a really pertinent ongoing development over, if you like, the evolution of TA, because originally, going back to its origins, parents split into, as I said, controlling parent stroke critical parent and nurturing parent, and they were initially seen as, oh well, perhaps controlling parent was bad and nurturing parent was good. There's been a lot of research over the years to say that both ego states have plus points and, you know, downsides. Equally, in terms of free child, originally, it was, in terms of child, split into what was called free child, this open expression of feelings, emotions, spontaneity, playfulness, and adapted child, where it went, if you like, underground. And then of itself, within adapted child, rebellious child, I like saying RC because that's the acronym.
So just say a bit more about undergrounds. Just explain what you mean by that.
In as much that it's not free expression. So you're adapting to the situation, and yet still you leak, if you like. Now your feelings are going to come out one way or another. Your emotions are going to come out one way or another. But in responding to the situation, in order to be, if we take a more of a psychotherapeutic view, to survive that situation, to live through that situation, to manage that situation, you split into, via adapted child, into either rebellious child or compliant child. So compliant child is the yes, yes, yes. And the rebellious child is, I'm going to show you through another route. Yeah? But the artful thing about that is that compliant child and rebellious child are two sides of a coin. So they flip consciously or subconsciously. Okay, does that tell you enough? So again, back in the day, free child was all positive and adapted child was seen as perhaps, you know, more dysfunctional. Whereas recognizing now that all of those ego states have plus points and they have potential downsides as well. So in terms of accessing them, often when we're in our ego states, and I said we're flipping in and out of them, when we're in adult, we may be triggered by something which sends us subconsciously back into parent, either, and equally so back into child, yeah, subconsciously. As coaches, as facilitators, as consultants, there is now, in recognizing that there's a positive aspects to all of the ego states, the art is in accessing them consciously. So through my adult, I pull on my parent, which might be either nurturing parent, for example, in demonstrating empathy, or in terms of controlling parent. There's been somebody waffling on like I am, and then you come in and you provide some structure or some boundary around that. So pulling on in service of the client, and equally so in terms of free child, it might be that you share something as my client and I'm feeling something internally, somatically even, and I choose consciously to share that with you in service of raising your awareness. So if you like, it's an offering, it's a gift. Does that give you?
Yeah. And I suppose that sort of sense of injecting energy, you know, into the session, I might access a bit of my sort of free child, you know. So yeah, that's that conscious piece, which, you know, seems really important.
Well, I think you've touched on again something really pertinent there, because behavior begets behavior. Yeah, and there's a lot in TA which is about transactions, which is how it can be complementary or how it can be crossed. So as a coach, as you say, by consciously, let's say, accessing your free child and offering up a technique, but lightly, playfully, yeah, actually invites, it's all about invitation, isn't it? Invites your client to connect playfully with what it is you're saying. It might be about humor, for example, might be about, there's an appropriate joke that's going on, which helps your client to actually connect with themselves, connect with their own free child.
Yeah, and I suppose again that's where that's taken me is, maybe the client's touched into a lot of emotion, and I will shift them into adults because I know they need to go back into their day job after they finish the coaching session. So what can I do that can create them into being more in the here and now and thinking about things such as what they're taking from the session, what are they going to do next. These questions enable them to move more into that adult state.
Well, precisely. And given that there is, I can't remember who the theorist was, but, we need to feel in order to think, in order to do. As coaches, we are consciously helping our clients to do that and to leave the session in a good place.
Yeah. So just in your experience, Sandra, coaches may be wondering, well, how do I shift back if I notice I'm impacted? So perhaps I don't know, the coachee shows up late, I'm noticing my parents coming in around, you should be here on time. What can I do in the moment to help me, I suppose, recenter to adult, and being in that adult and recontracting may be important as well, but how do I do that from that adult space?
So that you're given a great example of before clients even arrived. Yes, so you've done your mindfulness practice and you're really an adult, and then, as you say, clients late and you're being triggered. So I think it's about, firstly, the awareness that you're being triggered. It's about acknowledging that, and that in a sense there's almost in terms of the subpersonality, an appreciation that frustration is there to anchor you, is there to serve you, and yet it's in overdrive. And client hasn't arrived yet. So personally, what I do is remind myself of my own because what you're doing is you're being vulnerable. Is remind myself of my own vulnerability, and I take a breath. And that pause, that gap allows me to reconnect then with my adult. Yes. And serves me in then not badging or labeling my client even before they've arrived, in terms of, oh, you're a latecomer, and therefore that leads to all sorts of other possible stereotyping.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, take a breath.
Reground. Yeah.
And I hope, if you're listening, you can sort of start to see that, when we start to explore the ego states as one of the models from TA, that we can start to see dynamics really quickly, and it can be a really helpful way of helping the coachees understand, the dynamics they're meeting in relationships, in their work, etc. So question I just want, because I appreciate we've got 8 minutes left or so really for this conversation, but if coaches are really starting to become interested more in TA, Sandra, what would you say are some helpful ways that they can learn more around this model, this approach?
I think there are a number of things, and actually just flipping back very briefly to what we were just talking about, and how you were saying, well, how as coaches the models are so practical and applicable to one's client, in using with one client, and yet I think it starts with ourselves and our own self-awareness.
I agree.
And acknowledging about what's happening for us in the moment, And with that, and just going back to the example of frustration with the late client, is about having self-compassion and kindness, because we're human beings, and therefore, outside or indeed within the coaching session, things are going to happen that trigger you. And I think it's about being just aware of those, acknowledging those, and being kind to ourselves. And perhaps, depending on what it is, actually modeling our own vulnerability, having the courage to use self as instrument. So I think that's one of the things. Self-compassion, using self as instrument, applying some of these tools for ourselves, to ourselves, and also supervision, really. Supervision, both in terms of that, if you like, educative input that can happen during supervision, but most importantly, I think, for the restorative, this energy shift that you're talking about, and therefore leaving supervision with I'm okay, and client, they're okay. Yeah.
Thank you. And I agree completely about, trying it on and really applying it to yourself. Before, as always, whenever we train any coaches, before we use it with a client. And I suppose I'm conscious that coaches maybe think, well, if there are some ways that I can deepen my understanding around this more formally. For example, you're running a CPD session on the 30th of June around TA and flourishing. So that might be something that coaches might be interested in. But what else would you point to, Sandra?
Well, there's a lovely little book that I'm going to show you now, which is Transactional Analysis Coaching by Karen Pratt. Lots of practical tools in terms of, if you like, and a phrase I use is making coaching come alive. There's another book for those people who are really interested, and it's got lots of exercises in it, around Drama Triangle by Chris West. For those who may have already a modicum of knowledge around TA, there's a really good book. You can see I've got my piles of books here, which is, whilst it says educational transactional analysis, it is really about TA in non-therapeutic interventions, of which coaching is one. So yes, it's about education, it's about schooling and so on, but there is also some good pieces in here about adult learning, adult development, of which coaching is, by Giles Barrow and Shruti Newton. What else would I like to say? Oh yes, on the behavioural front, given that we've been talking about the functional model, becoming more and more prominent, some of you may already be aware of this, Susanna Temple, and the framework of functional fluency really has developed even further. There's a slight shift between TA and what they're meaning by functional fluency, but really making what they then call modes, how you can utilize your integrating adult even more from a behavioral standpoint. So those
Thank you, Sandra. So I'm conscious of time and we need to start pulling this conversation to a close. So first, I'm very grateful for you taking this time. But what haven't you shared so far that, for coaches sort of leaning a bit more into TA as a modality? It's just something you share from your experience.
What would I would share, yes, it's a relational model. Okay, fair enough. And there's lots of tools and techniques as we've talked about, albeit speedily. And remember the basics of coaching. So it's the contracting. There is TA. Make TA come alive through your contracting. That's where we start, don't we? In terms of fostering that relationship between ourselves and our client, where we are agreeing not only the logistical aspects of how we're going to work together, but also the, if you like, the psychological contract, which gives you an opportunity to really start to bring into play, how's this partnership going to take form? As coach, what, I don't mean to bring in jargon, but what pedagogy am I as coach coming with? Is it humanistic, which is about I'm here to, in partnership, help to develop my client? Or to what extent am I going to be actually stretching myself as coach, and in working with my client, they're learning, and I'm also learning as coach in the moment? That's really radical. So there's that. And also through contracting, you know, bringing to life the fact that you might be modeling as coach what you're supporting in your client. So vulnerability, courage. So that, yeah, I'd say remember your basics.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks for all the resources you shared. Thanks for the experience that you've brought as well in terms of this topic. To everybody listening, I hope that's been a helpful session. I'm sure Sandra and I will continue this conversation on future webinars, and look forward to connecting with you again soon. So thank you, and thanks again, Sandra.
Thank you, Damion, for giving me the space. Thank you.